Cold water dripped onto Silas's sleeping face. He lay on his cot in the high mountain cabin, the scent of pine and wet earth filling the small space. He had to fix the leaking roof before the first heavy snow of October sealed the pass. His last roll of tar paper had been shredded by a bear 2 weeks ago, and the nearest trading post was a 2-day walk. Failure meant a winter of damp misery and spoiled food, possibly forcing him and his son back to a town they had left for good. He sat up, the rough wool blanket scratching his shoulders. Dawn was a faint gray promise through the single glass pane of the window. Across the one-room cabin, his 6-year-old son Leo slept soundly in his own smaller cot, a thatch of sandy hair poking out from under a patchwork quilt. The boy was the reason for this life, the reason for the solitude and the hardship. The towns, with their noise and their sickness, had taken his wife 2 years prior. Silas had sworn they would not take his son. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold puncheon floor. He moved with a quiet economy, stoking the embers in the stone fireplace and adding a few pieces of split pine. The fire caught with a soft whoosh, and the room began to glow with a warm, flickering light. He filled the coffee pot with water from the bucket and set it on the iron hook over the flames. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. The drip from the ceiling continued its steady rhythm, a tiny clock marking the time he was losing. He looked up at the spot, a dark stain on the ceiling planks near the chimney. He had patched it with pine pitch twice, but the autumn rains had been relentless. Only proper tar paper would see them through the winter. He planned his journey while the coffee brewed. He would leave at sunrise, travel light, and reach Henderson's trading post by nightfall the next day. He would trade a few good beaver pelts for the paper, flour, salt, and maybe a small bag of candy for Leo. Then he would turn right around and push hard to be back before the weather turned. The thought of the flour reminded him. He lit a lantern and carried it to the small pantry he had built into the back wall of the cabin. Their supplies needed to be perfect before he left. He lifted the lid on the large flour barrel. Instead of the clean, white powder he expected, the surface seemed to move slightly in the lantern light. He leaned closer, his heart sinking. Weevils. Not just a few, but a writhing infestation that had turned his winter supply of bread into a ruin. The leak was a nuisance he could manage. The flour was a promise he might not be able to keep. A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach. The ruined flour changed everything. His simple supply run had just become a desperate gamble. He would need to trade for twice as much, which meant carrying more pelts down the mountain and hauling more weight back up. He quietly closed the lid on the barrel, deciding not to wake Leo with the bad news. The boy needed a peaceful morning. He cooked their usual breakfast of oatmeal and dried berries, the familiar routine a small comfort against the rising tide of worry. Leo ate with the cheerful energy of a child who trusted the world to provide. He chattered about a dream he had about a talking squirrel, and Silas listened, forcing a smile. After breakfast, he packed. He chose his 6 best beaver pelts, their fur thick and glossy. He added 2 fine mink skins as well, hoping they would be enough. He wrapped them in oilcloth and secured them in his largest pack. He also packed jerky, a small bag of oats, his sharpest knife, and a tin of matches. He explained to Leo that he had to go for supplies, just like he had before. He showed the boy the neat stack of firewood inside the cabin, the full water buckets, and the cooked stew waiting for him in a pot by the fire. "You keep the door barred, you hear me?" Silas said, crouching to look his son in the eye. "And you don't go outside for any reason. I'll be back in 4 days." Leo nodded, his expression serious. He was a mountain child, accustomed to solitude and responsibility that would have crushed a town boy. Still, Silas saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. "I'll bring you back some peppermint sticks," Silas promised. The boy's face brightened immediately. It was a small bribe for courage, but it worked. Silas shouldered his pack, the weight settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. He hugged his son one last time, the small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. Then he stepped out into the crisp morning air and closed the heavy plank door behind him. The path down from his claim was steep and treacherous, winding through dense stands of aspen and pine. The aspens were a brilliant, fiery yellow, their leaves trembling in the wind like 1,000 gold coins. It was a beautiful, lonely land. He walked for hours, his pace steady and relentless. He thought about the new pressure he was under. Henderson, the trading post owner, was a fair man, but he wasn't sentimental. Pelts were only worth what they were worth. Silas found himself hoping for a mild start to winter, a foolish wish in these high peaks. As the sun reached its zenith, he stopped to rest by a clear, fast-running creek. As he drank the cold water, he noticed something odd, a new blaze mark on a large ponderosa pine, not his own mark or any trail marker he recognized. It was a clean cut, an A inside a C. He had a bad feeling. The land was supposed to be his. The land deed carries an old stamp from the territory, not the state, but it was filed proper. He pushed the thought away and continued his descent. Nightfall found him in a small, sheltered meadow where he made a simple camp. He built a small fire, ate his jerky, and stared up at the brilliant canopy of stars. He missed the sound of Leo's breathing in the quiet cabin. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold companion by the fire. He was so focused on the roof and the flower that he almost missed the larger threat. It was a quiet kind of danger, the kind that arrives on paper before it arrives with axes. The new blaze mark was a sign that his isolation was about to be tested. He had come to these mountains to be left alone. He was beginning to understand that was a luxury he might no longer afford. The second day of travel was a long, grueling march through the foothills. The air grew thicker and carried the scent of wood smoke and civilization. Late in the afternoon, he saw the low, sod-roofed shape of Henderson's trading post nestled in a bend of the river. It was less a town and more a single point of contact for the trappers, prospectors, and scattered homesteaders in the region. A few horses were tied to the hitching rail out front. Silas shifted his heavy pack and pushed through the door. The interior was dark and smelled of leather, coffee, and pipe tobacco. Shelves overflowed with goods from cast iron pans and bolts of cloth to traps and sacks of beans. Two prospectors were hunched over a map at a small table, their voices a low murmur. Behind the long counter stood Jeb Henderson, a stout man with a magnificent gray beard that covered most of his chest. He was polishing a rifle with a practiced hand. He looked up as Silas entered, and his eyes registered a flicker of recognition. "Silas, thought that might be you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I heard a bear gave you some trouble up on your claim." News traveled slowly in the mountains, but it always traveled. "It got my tar paper," Silas said, shrugging off his pack, "and the weevils got my flour. I need to make a heavy trade, Jeb." Henderson grunted and leaned the rifle against the wall. He inspected the pelts Silas laid out on the counter, his fingers expertly probing the thickness of the fur. "These are prime. Should cover what you need." As Henderson calculated the trade, Silas's eyes wandered around the store. Tacked to a wooden post was a notice he hadn't seen before. It was a printed announcement, professional and clean, a stark contrast to the handwritten notes around it. It advertised the sale of land parcels by a company called the American Consolidated Timber and Mining Company. Their logo was a stylized A inside a C, the same mark he had seen blazed on the tree. "What's this?" Silas asked, nodding toward the notice. Henderson followed his gaze, and his expression soured. "Newcomers, from back east, buying up old claims, timber rights, anything they can get their hands on. They've got lawyers and land surveyors combing the whole territory." A sense of dread washed over Silas. His claim, filed years ago, felt secure, but he knew how men with money and lawyers operated. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from last winter who sold their claims to that company. They were gone now, their cabins empty. "They pay well," Henderson added, though he didn't sound happy about it. "But it's not about the money, is it? It's about being pushed out." Silas gathered his new supplies, his mind racing. The tar paper, the heavy sacks of flour and beans, the precious bag of peppermint sticks for Leo. It all felt temporary now. He had come here for a roof and for food, but he had found a new kind of threat, one he couldn't fight with an axe or a rifle. This enemy wore suits and carried contracts instead of claws. The wind picked up outside, whistling around the corners of the trading post. The sky to the west was a bruised purple, the color of a coming storm. He had planned to start back at first light, but now he felt a desperate urgency to get home, to stand on his own land and protect it. The problems of the wilderness were honest. A bear was a bear, a storm was a storm. He now faced a problem made by men, and it felt far more dangerous. Silas paid Henderson, settled his accounts, and repacked his gear. The new load was immense. the sacks of flour and beans adding a punishing weight. He could barely lift the pack to his shoulders. Henderson watched him, a concerned look on his face. "That storm's coming in fast, Silas. You'd be wise to wait it out here." "Leo's alone," Silas replied simply. It was all the explanation needed. He adjusted the straps, gritted his teeth against the weight, and headed out into the dying light. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against him and carrying the first sharp flakes of snow. He leaned into it, his head down, and began the long climb back up the mountain. He walked for hours long after darkness had fallen. The snow thickened, a swirling white curtain that reduced visibility to a few feet in the bobbing yellow circle of his lantern light. The trail, so clear on the way down, was now a treacherous ghost. Every step was a struggle. His muscles screamed in protest, and the straps of the pack dug deep into his shoulders. He thought only of Leo, alone in the cabin, waiting. That thought was the fuel that kept him moving. Around midnight, the blizzard became a gale. He knew it was foolish to continue. He found a small rock outcropping that offered minimal shelter from the wind and huddled beneath it. He couldn't risk a fire in these conditions. He pulled his wool blanket tight around himself and gnawed on a piece of jerky, the snow piling up around him. Sleep was impossible. He just waited, listening to the roar of the wind, feeling the cold seep into his bones. It was a profound and humbling loneliness, a reminder of how small he was against the power of the mountain. Anyone who has ever been truly alone in a storm knows that feeling. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The world was transformed, covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The air was still and painfully cold. Silas shook the snow from his blanket and forced his stiff limbs to move. The journey ahead was now even more dangerous. The snow hid rocks and roots, and the trail was completely gone. He had to rely on memory and the shape of the land to guide him. He pressed on, his breath pluming in the frigid air. By midday, he was making slow progress when he rounded a sharp bend in the path. And he stopped dead. Ahead, half buried in a snowdrift, was a wagon. It was tilted at a dangerous angle. One of its rear wheels shattered, the axle splintered and broken. Two tired-looking horses stood tethered to a tree, their heads hanging low. A woman was struggling to pull a heavy, canvas-wrapped crate from the back of the crippled vehicle. A small girl, no older than Leo, stood beside her, wrapped in a thick coat and crying softly. Silas instinctively moved behind a large pine, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Strangers in this part of the country were a risk, but the scene before him was one of desperation, not threat. The woman finally gave up on the crate and went to comfort the child, her movements weary and defeated. He could either ignore them and continue on his urgent path home, or he could help and risk everything. The child's cries cut through the cold air, a sound of pure misery. He thought of Leo. He stepped out from behind the tree. The woman saw him and gasped, pulling the little girl behind her. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe in her mid-20s, with a determined set to her jaw, despite the fear in her eyes. "I mean you no harm," Silas said, his voice rough from the cold. He held his hands up, open, to show he wasn't a threat. "My name is Silas. My cabin isn't far from here. You can't stay out in this." The woman, whose name was Alara, hesitated for a long moment. She looked at her daughter, then back at him. She saw not a threat, but a man just as weathered and tired as the mountains around them. The plan to fix his roof before the snow felt like a memory from another lifetime. He had a new immediate problem that overshadowed all the others. The storm did not care about his plans or his solitude. It only demanded a choice, and he had made it. Alara's caution slowly gave way to the reality of their situation. The little girl, Lily, had stopped crying and was now staring at Silas with wide, curious eyes. "Our axle broke on a hidden rock just as the snow started," Alara explained, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "We were trying to reach the settlement at Flat River Bend." "You're a long way from there," Silas said, his gaze falling on the shattered wheel. "And that wagon isn't going anywhere soon. My place is a half-day's walk from here. It's warm and there's food." He looked at the heavy crate. "What's in there?" "Books and scientific instruments," she said, a hint of defiance in her tone. "They're valuable. I can't leave them." The crate bears a mine mark that matches the seal of a university press in the East, an unusual sight in these parts. Silas sighed. He couldn't possibly carry his own supplies and help with the crate, but he also couldn't leave them with nothing. We'll unhitch the horses, he decided. We can use them to carry my supplies and some of your things. We'll have to come back for the rest when the weather clears. It took them nearly an hour to transfer the load. Silas secured his sacks of flour and the precious tar paper onto the back of one horse. Ilara packed a smaller satchel of personal items and food onto the other. Lily, now bundled in more blankets, would ride with her mother. Silas insisted on taking the heavy crate of books himself, creating a makeshift sledge from a broken piece of the wagon and some rope. It was a clumsy, back-breaking solution, but it was the only one. The journey to the cabin was brutally slow. Silas pulled the sledge, its runners digging into the deep snow, while Ilara led the horses. Lily was quiet now, exhausted from the ordeal. They spoke little, saving their energy for the climb. Silas learned that Ilara and her daughter had been traveling from a town farther south, and that her husband was supposed to have met them. He hadn't shown up. She didn't offer more, and he didn't ask. Every person in the mountains had a story they preferred to keep buried. They finally reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and orange. The sight of the small, sturdy structure, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney, was the most welcoming thing Ilara had ever seen. When Silas pushed the door open, Leo was sitting at the small table, carefully drawing a picture on a piece of slate. He looked up, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw his father. Then his eyes fell on Ilara and Lily, and the smile vanished, replaced by a look of wary confusion. Silas quickly explained the situation, his voice soft and reassuring. He introduced the children, who simply stared at each other from across the room. The small cabin suddenly felt very crowded. While Ilara tended to Lily, removing her wet clothes and wrapping her in a dry blanket by the fire, Silas finally inspected his roof from the inside. The drip was worse. A small puddle had formed on the floor. His mission to get the tar paper had succeeded, but the storm had beaten him home. He had solved one problem only to find himself in the middle of a much more complicated one. The shelter he had built for two was now a refuge for four, and outside the temperature was dropping fast, promising a long, hard freeze. He had brought the strangers out of the storm. Now he had to figure out how they could all survive the winter together. The first few days were an exercise in awkward courtesy. The cabin, once a space of comfortable routine for Silas and Leo, now felt cramped and unsettled. Ilara and Lily took up the corner where Silas normally mended his traps. Their presence filled the silence with a new rhythm of quiet conversation and a child's occasional laughter. Silas found himself moving with a self-conscious stiffness, constantly aware of the intrusion. He spent the first clear day on the roof, Leo handing him tools from the ladder below. Ilara watched from the doorway, holding Lily's hand. The work was difficult in the cold. The tar paper was stiff, and his fingers grew numb as he hammered the nails. But with each secured strip, he felt a measure of control returning. He was a man who understood physical problems. A leaking roof could be fixed with labor and materials. He was less certain about the complexities of sharing his life, even temporarily. Ilara, for her part, tried to make herself useful. She was a surprisingly good cook, turning their simple stores of beans and salted pork into savory stews. She had a small bag of dried herbs that she had gathered, and she used them to bring a new flavor to their meals. She also took over mending the clothes, her stitching fine and even. The children, after a day of cautious circling, found a common language in play. Leo showed Lily his collection of smooth river stones and carved wooden animals. Lily, in turn, showed him a picture book from her mother's satchel, its pages filled with beautifully detailed drawings of plants and flowers. Their whispers and giggles began to fill the corners of the cabin, a sound Silas hadn't realized he had missed. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Silas was sharpening his knife by the fire. Ilara was sketching in a small leather-bound notebook, her pencil moving with practiced speed. "You draw well," Silas commented, breaking the silence. "My father was a botanist at a university," she said without looking up. "He taught me how to observe things, how to see the detail." She turned the book so he could see. It was a drawing of a small, hardy flower he had seen growing near the rocks on his claim. The detail was incredible, from the delicate veins on the petals to the fine hairs on the stem. This was more than a hobby. It was a skill, a profession. A life in the wild is a constant ledger of skills. He realized her knowledge might be a different kind of resource, as valuable as a strong back or a good aim. He had rescued a traveler from the snow. He was beginning to suspect he had brought home something much more complicated and perhaps much more valuable. The delicate drawing of the mountain flower was a testament to a life he couldn't imagine. It was also a clue that his quiet world was about to change in ways he had not foreseen. A week passed, then another. The heavy snows of early winter settled in, making a return trip for Alara's wagon impossible. A temporary arrangement was becoming a long-term reality. The four of them fell into a new routine, dictated by the weather and the needs of their small household. Silas hunted and chopped wood, his days spent in the silent, white world outside the cabin. Alara managed the cooking, cleaning, and the children's lessons. She used her books to teach both Leo and Lily how to read and identify different types of trees and animal tracks. The cabin became a strange mix of wilderness survival and quiet academia. Silas found himself listening in on the lessons, learning the names of plants he had only ever known as good for tinder or bad to eat. One afternoon, Silas returned from checking his trap lines, a brace of fat rabbits slung over his shoulder. He found Alara at the table, her precious instruments unpacked from the large crate. She had a microscope, a set of delicate brass scales, and several wooden presses for drying flowers. Leo and Lily were watching, mesmerized, as she showed them a snowflake under the lens. "Everyone is different, see?" she was explaining softly. "Nature never makes the same thing twice." Silas stood in the doorway, stomping the snow from his boots, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He was a man of the broad, sweeping landscape. Her world was one of intricate, hidden details. He saw the whole mountain. She saw the single, unique crystal of snow. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It wasn't resentment, but a kind of bewilderment. His life had been simple, defined by clear goals. Stay warm, stay fed, keep Leo safe. Her presence introduced a new complexity, a new way of seeing the world that was both fascinating and unsettling. That night, a wolf howled from the ridge above the cabin, a long, lonely cry. Leo, who usually slept through the night, stirred in his cot. Silas went to him, smoothing his hair until he settled back to sleep. He looked across the room. In the dim firelight, he could see Alara, awake in her own bed, her eyes open and staring at the ceiling. They were two lonely islands in the same small room, each guarding their own past and their own fears. The quiet intimacy of their forced proximity was beginning to feel more profound than simple survival. A man listening from a distance might think it a story of rescue. It was instead a story of collision, two different worlds trapped in a single small space by the snow. The wolf howled again, a sound that spoke of the vast, uncaring wilderness outside. Inside the cabin, a fragile and unspoken truce was solidifying into something that might eventually resemble a partnership. But for now, it was just shared space, shared food, and shared silence. December arrived, bringing with it a deep and abiding cold that settled into the bones of the land. The sun was a pale disk in the sky, offering little warmth. The world outside the cabin was a study in white and gray. Inside, the fire was the center of their universe, a constant source of heat and light. The close quarters were forcing a kind of reluctant intimacy. Silas learned that Alara hummed quietly when she was concentrating. Alara learned that Silas had a habit of staring into the fire for long stretches, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. One evening, a fierce wind rattled the window pane and drove snow against the door. Lily had developed a cough, a dry hacking sound that worried Alara. She made a tea from pine needles and honey, an old remedy Silas's wife used to use. As she stirred the mixture over the fire, Silas spoke. "My wife, Sarah, she passed from a lung fever. Started with a cough just like that." He hadn't spoken his wife's name in front of a stranger since she died. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. Alara stopped stirring. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Lily is strong. She just needs rest." "The town doctor couldn't do anything for Sarah," Silas continued, his voice low. "Said it was God's will. I think it was bad medicine in a town full of sickness." It was the most he had ever revealed about his past. He was explaining without saying it why he was here. Why he had chosen this harsh, lonely life over the supposed comforts of civilization. He was protecting Leo not just from illness, but from a world he no longer trusted. The conversation was a turning point. It was a shared vulnerability, a small crack in the walls they had both built around themselves. After that, the silence between them felt different, less like a void and more like a shared space. They began to talk more, sharing small stories of their past. She told him about growing up in a city in the East, of her father's academic world, and of her own desire to document the flora of the uncharted territories. He, in turn, told her about the land, about the ways of the animals, and about the deep peace he found in the mountains. Anyone can see that trust is built not in grand gestures, but in small shared truths spoken in the quiet of a winter's night. A few days later, a man on snowshoes appeared at the edge of the Clee. The deep winter months became a period of quiet consolidation. The cabin, once a symbol of Silas's solitude, transformed into a small, breathing world of its own. While he maintained their physical survival with the steady rhythm of axe and rifle, Elara fostered a different kind of life within its walls. She taught the children their letters using charcoal on a smooth piece of pine bark. She identified every edible root and hardy lichen within a short walk of the cabin, expanding their diet in small, surprising ways. Her knowledge was not of the grand, dangerous things that Silas understood, like the weight of a coming storm or the temper of a cornered wolf. Hers was a knowledge of the small and the resilient, the things that survive by being overlooked. He found himself watching her, a new habit he could not seem to break. He watched her hands as she sketched the delicate frost patterns on the windowpane. He listened to her voice, calm and even, as she explained to the children how a seed holds the entire memory of a tree. He had built his life on the principle of subtraction, removing himself from a world that had taken too much. Elara, he realized, lived by addition. She built, she cataloged, she connected things. She was creating a map of this small piece of the world, and in doing so, she was mapping a place for herself within it. One evening, after the children were asleep in their cots, a profound stillness settled over the cabin. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced on the log walls. Silas was mending a snowshoe frame, his hands moving with practiced economy. Elara sat across from him, cleaning the lens of her microscope with a soft piece of doeskin. "My husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper, and Silas's hands froze. She had never spoken of him. "The man I was supposed to meet. His name was Arthur. He was a good man. Kind." She paused, her gaze fixed on the polished brass of the instrument. "He believed in my work. He was a cartographer. He thought we could make a life out here, charting the unknown places. He went ahead to secure a place for us at the settlement. I received one letter, then nothing." The silence that followed was different. It was not the comfortable silence of shared solitude, but the heavy silence of shared grief. Silas knew that silence well. It was the shape of the space left behind by someone who was supposed to be there. "He died," she said, the words flat and final. "A letter finally found me weeks later at a way station, a logging accident. He was gone before I even began my journey." She looked at Silas then, her eyes clear and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. "I wasn't traveling to meet him, Silas. I was traveling to his grave. The books, the instruments, they were all we had left of our shared dream. I thought if I could just get to the place he had chosen, I could, I don't know, continue his work, honor his memory." He said nothing. There were no words for that kind of loss. He simply picked up the snowshoe frame and resumed his work, the steady rapping of the sinew a quiet answer. He understood. They were both ghosts, in a way, haunted by the lives they were supposed to have lived. The wilderness had not been an escape for either of them. It had been the only place left to go. Anyone who has ever been truly lost knows that you do not choose the path. The path chooses you. January gave way to a brutal February. A great storm rolled in from the north, burying the cabin in a deep, silent blanket of snow. For 3 days they could not see the tree line. The world shrank to the four walls of their home. It was on the second day of the storm that Lily's cough returned, this time a deep, rattling sound from her chest. Her fever climbed quickly. Elara sat by her side, bathing her forehead with snowmelt, her face a mask of controlled panic. Silas recognized the sound of that cough. It was the same sound that had stolen Sarah from him, a sound like wet leaves being crushed underfoot. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the calm he had so carefully cultivated. He felt the old helplessness rising in him, the ghost of the town doctor shrugging his shoulders. But this time was different. Alara was not helpless. She went to her crate of scientific supplies and brought out a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of sealed glass vials containing seeds and dried plant matter. Cinchona, she said, holding up a vial filled with reddish bark shavings. From a contact in South America. My father acquired it for his research. The bark produces quinine. She looked at him, her expression desperate and determined. It's a fever reducer, a powerful one, but the dose has to be exact. She spent the next hour with her brass scales, weighing out a minuscule amount of the bark. She ground it into a fine powder with a stone pestle and mixed it with honey and warm water. While Silas held Lily, propping her up against his chest, Ilara carefully fed the mixture to her daughter, a single spoonful at a time. Then they waited. The storm raged outside, its fury a counterpoint to the tense silence within the cabin. Silas held the small, feverish girl, feeling the frantic beating of her heart against his own. He was no longer just a protector. He was a participant in a battle he did not understand, a battle fought with powders and scales against an enemy he could not see. He looked at Alara, who watched her daughter's every breath, and he saw a strength that dwarfed his own. His strength was in his arms and his aim. Hers was in her mind, in the knowledge she had so carefully carried across a continent. By morning the storm had broken, and so had the fever. Lily was weak, but her breathing was easier, her skin cool to the touch. The relief in the cabin was a physical thing, a presence as real as the sunlight that now streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ilara finally slept, slumped in her chair, her hand resting on her daughter's cot. Leo, who had been watching everything with wide, fearful eyes, crawled onto Silas's lap and buried his face in his father's chest. Silas held his son, looking at the two people he had rescued from the snow. He had thought he was offering them shelter. He was wrong. They were offering him a reason to fight back against the ghosts of his past. He had not been able to save his wife, but in this small, crowded cabin, he had helped Ilara save her child. It was not a victory, perhaps, but it felt like a truce with the memories that had hunted him into the mountains. The thaw came in early March, a slow, dripping affair that turned the world to mud and slush. The path down the mountain would soon be clear. The unspoken question of what came next hung in the air, a tension that settled over their morning meals and evening silences. Ilara's wagon, her books, her entire former life, waited for her down in the valley. The purpose of her journey to reach the settlement where her husband was buried remained unfulfilled. One morning, Silas took his rifle and went hunting, needing the cold air and the familiar solitude of the forest. As he moved through the dripping pines, he saw it, a fresh blaze on a tree, a clean cut through the bark. It was the mark of the American Consolidated Timber and Mining Company, the A inside the C. It was farther up the mountain than the one he had seen in the fall, closer to his claim, a clear sign they were advancing. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, settled in his stomach. The fight he had seen coming was still coming. He had been so consumed with the immediate survival of the winter that he had forgotten about the other kind of threat, the one that came with papers and surveyors. He returned to the cabin late in the day, 2 squirrels hanging from his belt. He did not say what he had seen. The peace within the cabin was too fragile, and he did not want to be the one to break it. But the knowledge sat with him, a heavy weight. He looked at Alara, now teaching Lily how to press a small, early-blooming mountain crocus between the pages of a book. He looked at Leo, who was carving a piece of wood into the shape of a wolf, a skill Silas had taught him. This was a home now. It was crowded and complicated, but it was a home. The thought of losing it, of being driven off by men with contracts and dollar signs in their eyes, filled him with a rage so pure it felt like a flame in his chest. The next day, 2 men appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were not trappers. They wore sturdy canvas coats and carried survey equipment, a tripod and a long measuring chain. One of them, a tall man with a thin, weathered face, stepped forward. He did not look at the cabin but at the land, his eyes scanning the tree line, the creek, the very lay of the ground. Silas stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hand. Ilara appeared in the doorway behind him, her face pale. "This is private property," Silas said, his voice a low growl. The man finally looked at him. His expression was not hostile, just tired. "Name's Peterson," he said. "I'm the lead surveyor for the ACTM. We're just marking the company's new boundary lines." "Your boundary line is on my claim," Silas stated. Peterson sighed and pulled a folded map from his coat pocket. He spread it on a large, flat rock. It was a detailed topographical map of the entire region. Red lines had been drawn across it, dividing the mountains into neat, numbered parcels. He pointed a finger at a section that encompassed Silas's cabin and the surrounding land. According to the revised state registry, this entire parcel, number 734, reverted to public domain last year. The company bought it legally at auction. Ilara stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "On what grounds did it revert?" Peterson looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "The original territorial deed was never refiled with the state after the boundary reorganization of '72. It's a clerical issue. Happens all the time." It was the same argument Fletcher had made at the trading post, the same bureaucratic knife in the back. But hearing it here, on his own land, made it real. "We ain't leaving," Silas said, the words coming out hard as stone. Peterson looked from Silas's rifle to Ilara's determined face, and then to the cabin, where two small faces were now visible in the window. He folded his map slowly. "Look," he said, his voice dropping. "I just draw the lines. I don't make the rules, but I can tell you this. The company man Fletcher, he'll be through here in a week or two with the marshal to serve the eviction notice. You can't fight the marshal." He paused, his gaze lingering on the children. "I've seen this before. It doesn't end well for the folks who try to fight." He and the other man gathered their equipment and left, their figures receding back into the woods, leaving silence in their wake. That night, the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. The threat was no longer a possibility. It had a name and a date. A week. In a week, their world would be torn apart. Silas stared into the fire, the rifle across his lap. He thought of running again, of taking Leo and disappearing into the deeper wilderness. But he looked at Ilara, and he knew he could not. He could not ask her to abandon her husband's grave a second time. He could not uproot Lily again. Running was a solitary solution, and he was no longer a solitary man. Ilara came and sat beside him. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "My husband's maps. They were his passion. He believed a map was more than just lines on paper. He said it was a story of the land, of who had lived there, of what it was worth." She looked at the fire. "Your claim has a story, Silas. The story is in the stones you used to build that chimney. It's in the ditch you dug to water your garden. It's in the years you've lived here. A legal deed is one kind of story, but there are older ones." She stood and went to her crate. She did not pull out a book on law. She pulled out a half-finished map, one of Arthur's. It was a beautiful piece of work, the lines drawn with an artist's hand. She laid it on the table. "We can't fight their map," she said softly, "so we have to make our own." For the next 6 days, they worked with a feverish intensity. They were no longer preparing for a legal battle. They were preparing for a final stand. Guided by Arthur's unfinished work and her own knowledge, Ilara began to create a new map of Silas's claim. But this map did not show property lines or timber value. It showed other things. She marked the stand of cinchona trees as a unique medicinal grove. She documented a vein of unusual rose-colored quartz she had found by the creek, labeling it a significant mineralogical feature. With Silas's help, she mapped the game trails, the nesting sites of a pair of golden eagles on the high ridge, and the deep pool where the oldest trout lived. Her map told the story of a living, breathing place, not a parcel to be clear-cut. While she drew, Silas worked outside. He did not build barricades. He built a future. With a grim determination, he cleared a new patch of land for a larger garden. He reinforced the roof of the animal pen. He split and stacked enough firewood for 2 winters, not just one. Every swing of his axe was an act of defiance, a declaration that he was not leaving. The children watched, sensing the shift in the air, and helped in their own small ways, gathering kindling and carrying water. They were all defending their home now. On the 7th day they came. Fletcher was there, his fine wool coat looking absurd in the muddy clearing. With him was the U.S. Marshal, a grim-faced man with a silver star on his vest, and two armed deputies. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their presence an invasion. Silas met them standing in front of his cabin. He was not holding a rifle. His hands were empty. Ilara stood just behind him, holding a rolled-up piece of parchment. It was her map. "Silas," Fletcher began, his voice smooth and confident, "I have the official eviction order from the circuit court. This is Marshal Kane. I'm afraid this is the end of the road." Silas just looked at him, his silence more unnerving than any threat. The marshal stepped forward, unfolding a document. "The law's the law, son. The company has the title. You have until sundown to vacate the property." It was then that Ilara stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Marshal, before you enforce that order, you should know that this is not simply a squatter's claim. This is a site of significant scientific and medicinal value. This land contains the only known stand of high-altitude Cinchona officinalis in this territory, a vital source of quinine." Fletcher scoffed. "A few special trees don't change a land title." "It's more than that," Ilara continued, unrolling her map on the same flat rock the surveyor had used. Marshal Kane leaned over, his curiosity piqued. Ilara's map was unlike any he had ever seen. It was filled with detailed illustrations, notes, and scientific classifications. "This claim is also the habitat for a nesting pair of golden eagles, a protected species under federal statute. And my late husband, Arthur Vance, a cartographer commissioned by the territorial governor, had begun a formal survey of this region for inclusion in the National Archive. His preliminary findings, which I have here, designate this specific area as a potential state preserve due to its unique ecosystem." She was bluffing, weaving together threads of truth and hope, law and science, into a story so compelling it began to feel real. She was fighting a map with a better map, a story with a better story. Fletcher's face had paled. The words federal statute and governor were not part of his simple eviction plan. He turned to the marshal. "This is nonsense. She's just making this up." Marshal Kane did not look at Fletcher. He looked at the map. He looked at Ilara's earnest face. He looked at Silas, standing like a mountain himself, unmovable. He looked at the cabin, at the huge woodpile, at the newly cleared garden plot. He saw the evidence not of an illegal squatter, but of a home. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West. He knew the difference between a legal right and what was right. He slowly folded the eviction notice and tucked it back into his coat. "The company may have the title," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But this woman has raised issues of federal jurisdiction. I cannot enforce a state eviction order on a property that may be subject to federal protection. It's a tangled knot." He looked directly at Fletcher. "You'll have to take it back to the federal courts. It could take years to sort out." Fletcher stared, his mouth agape. He had been outmaneuvered not by force, but by a story. Defeated, he turned without another word and stalked back into the woods, his deputies following him. Marshal Kane lingered for a moment. He nodded once to Silas, a gesture of grudging respect. Then he too was gone. They stood in the silent clearing, the four of them, surrounded by the quiet woods. They had not won. They had only earned a reprieve. The company would be back, with more lawyers and more papers. But they had faced the threat together and held their ground. Silas looked at Ilara, at the map still spread on the rock, a testament to her courage and intelligence. He looked at Leo and Lily, who were now chasing a butterfly near the new garden plot. The sun was warm on his face. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the scent of spring, the scent of a new beginning. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude, a place to hide from the world. But the world had found him. It had brought him a storm, and in the heart of the storm, it had brought him a family. He reached down and took Ilara's hand. Her fingers curled around his. It was enough, for now it was everything.